Hey everyone, so welcome to the Chapter 11 lecture, which is, as you can see, a lecture on jQuery plugins and jQuery UI. And as I was starting to say before I hit record, I always enjoy this chapter because you get a lot of functionality with jQuery plugins without a lot of effort. It's kind of like the bootstrap for HTML. How you get a lot of functionality with Bootstrap without a lot of coding, and it really simplifies tasks. And that's essentially what you get with jQuery plugins. You get a way to simplify jQuery with these things called plugins. And so I really enjoy talking about this because of that reason. And so I always enjoy this lecture, and I enjoy kind of going through this. And so that's the importance of Chapter 11. I always like to talk about why would we study this. jQuery plugins really simplifies the task of even writing jQuery. And if you think of what is jQuery, a lot of the tasks in jQuery simplifies the task of writing JavaScript. So it's almost more abstract. If jQuery simplifies JavaScript, or a lot of what JavaScript can do, not everything, but jQuery simplifies a lot of what JavaScript can do, jQuery plugins then simplify jQuery. And so as we get into this, everyone knows how to do a Google search. Point being on slide 4 is that there are a lot of plugins online, and they're not in any individual place. You can find jQuery plugins anywhere online, and the reason for that is that they're open source, right? So you could create a jQuery plugin by writing jQuery, saving your script into a .js file, so saving your jQuery in a .js file, and then making it downloadable for other people to use. Okay, so plugins simplify jQuery, and they're open source in the sense that anyone that can write jQuery can make a plugin and then make it downloadable. Okay, for that reason, because they're pretty much open to anyone who wants to write jQuery, for that reason, there's a lot of really good plugins and there's a lot of really bad plugins. Okay, you're going to get a wide array of quality of the plugins, whether they work well, whether they're efficient, whether they're they're good, efficient jQuery that executes efficiently, or whether they're slow and laggy and they don't work well. And then another big piece of these plugins that's really important, especially for us, is the documentation side. So if I were to create a plugin, well, I know how to use it because I created it. But does that mean that you know how to use my plugin? Probably not. So what I have to then do is, as a developer, yes, I have to code the plugin and make the plugin, but then I also have to make a good document or a good way for you to learn how to use my plugin, and that's going to be with documentation. So the quality of jQuery plugins can be great, or it can be really poor. And part of that is the documentation. What can help make a plugin great is great documentation and easy to understand, basically, how to use these plugins. And so you can have a great plugin, but if it's not documented well, no one's going to learn how to use it, and so it would kind of be to waste. There are a couple of places where, again, you can look at GitHub, SourceForge, code.google.com. I mean, these are all, just a couple of starting points to search. I think a Google search for, popular jQuery plugins 2020, something like that. You can see there's no shortage of them. Everyone has a list for something. And so, again, you get a lot of functionality, a lot of different plugins do a lot of different things. I will, in this lecture, pick a plugin and demonstrate it, okay, just so you kind of can see the process. Live COVID-19 statistics widgets. As if it's not already in your face everywhere already. You could put it on your website. So again, there's a lot of plugins out there. They do a lot of different things. You got to spend some time kind of just researching it, probably with a Google search, similar to what I did. Some of the things that are very common for plugins, and what I'm going to do is like an image gallery. In fact, I've historically always used this one called FancyBox. And so this URL here is actually what I'm going to demonstrate. So this is an image jQuery plugin, and obviously the ones for displaying images versus slideshow and carousels, as it turns out nowadays, FancyBox can also do a slideshow. But displaying images one at a time versus a slideshow, I mean, one that just goes from one image to the next, and a carousel is where the user can interact with it and click on the next button. But these are basically all image plugins, and so FancyBox is the one that I'm going to demonstrate, but they all basically work the same way. In fact, these are the steps, if you want to kind of read the steps that I'm going to do, but I just figure I'd demonstrate it instead of just listing the steps here. Fancybox.net is actually the old URL, and if you actually go there, it'll tell you it's the old URL right at the top. The new one, basically the updated FancyBox, is at fancyapps.com, and actually it redirects you to this directory here, FancyBox 3. Okay, and a couple things that I like about FancyBox is it tends to have pretty good documentation. Okay, which is, again, I think documentation is critical. When you're working with plugins, it's always an experimentation process. Okay, it's not like there's one set of code that I, as a teacher, can give you and it's gonna work, for every purpose, right? These plugins have a million purposes. Okay, so what I can do is I can show you the process of how to get a plugin to work. Okay, and then you follow this general process, but it's not going to be the same set of code every time. You just have to be familiar with the process. Okay, so I like FancyBox because I think it has decent enough documentation, which is important for plugins because, again, if you have poor documentation, you're going to have a really hard time getting this to work or getting your plugin to work. You can see it's got a quick start. So what is the process? Well, if you were to look at the slideshow, it's going to tell you step one is to link to the jQuery library. No surprise there. We're learning jQuery, so when we're dealing with jQuery plugins, we have to link to jQuery first. Okay, so the order does matter here. You do have to link to jQuery before you link to the plugin script. Okay, the plugin script is going to be jQuery, So you have to load jQuery first for the browser to understand the plugin script. So when I'm saying the plugin script, that's what this line right here. Now, I also like this because this is a nice CDN. We don't have to download anything, which is just another step that we don't have to do. So I prefer to use the CDNs when available. So here's a CDN to jQuery, and here's a CDN to the FancyBox script. You notice what I'm highlighting there is jQuery FancyBox. Okay, so link to jQuery first, then link to FancyBox. And typically, there's also a CSS file. And if you look what I'm highlighting here, this is a CDN for a CSS file. And if you actually want to look at that CSS file, of course, you could copy that and throw that into the browser, and you get a minified CSS file. Compressed CSS file, but just showing you that that's all we have here is a bunch of CSS written for FancyBox, specifically for FancyBox. Okay, at that point you're pretty well ready to use FancyBox. Okay, and step 2, right? So you add some scripts, you add some CSS. Step 2 is create your links. Now what you're going to notice about this is that these are image links, right? And we've done image links back in chapter 4 of our HTML book, where we have an anchor tag, and inside of the anchor tag we have an image. You'll notice this anchor tag has a unique attribute called data-FancyBox gallery. Other than that attribute, other than this attribute that I'm highlighting right here, these are your standard image links, okay? And in fact, I should better describe them as thumbnails, because that's really what they are. We've got a small image that the user is seeing, but yet when the user clicks on the small image, it takes them to a bigger version of that image. Okay, so these are thumbnails, which are inherently image links. Okay, so that's really all it takes to get started. But here, for a guide on using FancyBox, visit our learning section. So I'm going to click on that, and you'll notice that just takes you to the how to use portion of the documentation, right? So this is just, if I go back to the home page and I click on documentation, it just takes me to this how to use section. So let's whip up some code together. Let's use FancyBox. File, open folder. This is chapter 11. Not HTML. This is chapter 11 JavaScript. And we got an empty index page. And so in their documentation, of course, you can download and link to everything locally, or you can just directly link to the CDNs, which is what I prefer. And back on the home page, they basically give you the CDNs right here. So I'm going to put the CDNs here. Now I'll put my CSS up in my head. So there's my FancyBox CSS. Let me format this and let me make that more visible. And then I'm gonna put the scripts at the bottom of the body. Here's my CDN to jQuery, and here's my CDN to FancyBox plugin, jQuery. So trying to keep it simple, I think this is the process that you would follow on any new plugin, and I always recommend just starting off in the most simple way that you can, okay, without trying to do too much. So let's go to the learning section, and part of this is taking your time through the documentation, right? Not trying to rush through and just copy and paste code, but actually trying to read and understand. Okay, so when you come to this documentation, it's easy to just copy and paste some code, right? But let's read a little bit about what's going on. Initialize with data attributes. The most basic way to use FancyBox is by adding the data -FancyBox attribute to your element. We kind of already saw that. This will automatically bind a click event that will start FancyBox. Use the href or data source attribute to specify the source of your content. So here we're creating a link that's going to link to an image. We've got the data FancyBox attribute that they talk about here. There's a data caption, and then here's our thumbnail.jpg. So this would be our small image, this would be our large image. And they actually, what I liked about this too when I was looking at it, is they have a code pen demo. So they actually put all of this together in a little bit of a demonstration. Now you can see they don't have the JavaScript linked here. This is purely the HTML. And this looks like Bootstrap because they're using margin on the y-axis here. So it looks like they're using some Bootstrap, which is fine. But here, let's take a look. We got a paragraph that's surrounding all of these image links. Okay, so all of these image links are in a paragraph, so they're going to be on the same line. That would be the case anyways. This class has a class of image list. So what that tells me is that there's probably some CSS associated with the class of image list. Okay, we haven't really seen that in the documentation, but that tells me a little something there. Here's our link to our large image, and then here is the thumbnail image, and they're using the actual URLs. In the anchor tag, they have our data FancyBox, and they have a caption, and you could see the effect here. Okay, now of course, I mean, ultimately this is one thing, this is the easiest way that we can get FancyBox to work, and all we have here is more of a transitioning thumbnail, right? So it opens up, it's on the same page, we're not changing pages, and this is kind of what you're getting with FancyBox. Now I just got done kind of saying, okay, let's not just jump in and copy and paste all the code, but I tried to take my time with it, tried to understand a little bit of how this is going to work. And let's just take this into my code editor at this point. Now, the copy and paste kind of broke some things here. Let's actually, it wasn't copy and paste that broke, it was my formatting. It just put the attribute on the next line. All right, let's launch. Okay, and so what we're getting out of the box with FancyBox is this transitioning effect this is a lot nicer, right, than what we did in the first 40 days of this class. Okay, but FancyBox can do more, so don't be like, disappointed, and this is what you get. You kind of get this little zoom in feature. And then down here is your caption. Single photo caption can contain any HTML elements. So kind of come back into here. It says caption can contain any HTML elements. So here the data caption, that's what you see. I'm glad you like it. I like it too. Right? This image has a single caption. So kind of come back to the second one. And it says caption can contain elements. So I'm just experimenting here. I would not think this would work. Now, I'm going to have to use the escape sequence ampersand less than h1 ampersand greater than, right? So this is your escape sequence for HTML to get your angle brackets. And that's what you can put inside of your and I'm just pick that up because of what I saw up here. Ampersand oh, wait a minute. So that was my opening H1. This is my closing H1. Ah, no, nice. We got a little H1 down here now. Now, of course, that's the most simple code demonstration, but that's getting started. As we go down, if you have a group of items, you could use data FancyBox value for each of them to create a gallery. Each group should have a unique value. So notice here, data FancyBox does not have any assignment. So I wonder, so interesting if we just throw the ID of gallery on here. So I'll just put gallery on 2 of them. And then on this third one, which doesn't have a caption, I'm just going to put gallery 2 just because I'm curious what it does. And so this is the process. I mean, you kind of experiment with it. Now, check this out. Just by adding the equal sign and giving it a value, now we get the scrolling effect that we no longer had. We didn't have that before, I should say, right? So these two are in their own gallery, and then this one's unique. It doesn't have a scroll. So if you want them to scroll between, it's pretty simple to do that by giving a value to the attribute data FancyBox. Let's throw another one in. It's basically the same thing. You can see that these two slide. It's the same picture. And then this one slides. I could probably spend 4 hours just demonstrating FancyBox because all I've done is I've got through the first 2 examples. And you can see there's no shortage in code demonstrations and what it can do. Let me go back a little bit here. It talks about its features, demonstrations. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you get a lot of features out of one plugin. So here you got kind of a small image gallery that you can scroll even with different sized photos. Having a video. Putting a video inside of Fancy Box is a thing. So putting a little, YouTube video. Coming down through here, you can mix images, videos, and other content in a gallery. So here's like a form. Here's an image. Here's a modal window. Google Map. So the content, it doesn't just have to be images. The point being, here's all this different content that you can put inside which I think that's pretty useful. Putting an image map inside of clickable item, have it pop up and zoom in and show the address, and it just goes on. Now the one thing that's worth noting is that if you use this on a commercial site, it's free while you're in school and while you're learning. If you put this on a commercial site, it costs $30. Okay, so that is, I guess, the downside is that some plugins that are, especially the good ones, might cost. Okay, but especially while we're in school, and for learning purposes, it's free and you don't have to pay for it. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else I want to say about this before I move on. Again, I do like the CodePen demos. Oh, this talked about groups. We already did the groups demonstration. So we already did groups. The one thing, there's kind of a fourth step that a lot of plugins require, and I say a fourth step, whatever number it is, might not be 4. And that next stop, the next step, is that as you get into customizing, or a lot of times just even to use the plugin, you have to run a Jquery method. And so a lot of plugins require one more step that I did not demonstrate, and that's to run a little bit of Jquery that looks something like this. So now if I go down to my link to Jquery, link to the Fancy Box plugin, and then you got to write a little bit of custom Jquery. And it's not really custom. And typically what this method does, this method starts Fancy Box. And well, you just can't put this in the middle of nowhere. You got to put it inside of document. So as you get down and really start to customize Fancy Box, notice we've got our selector, and our selector says, okay, any attribute that has a value of gallery, which you'll notice that these two have an attribute of gallery. Okay, so So it is dependent on the value that you put inside of this data fancy box attribute. This would not apply for gallery 2. This only applies for gallery, the first gallery. Okay, and then what you end up putting down here are very similar to these options. Let's see if I can show you what an option looks like. So this is Fancy Box with a filter, and you've probably seen these kinds of image galleries before, where you can display like different pieces of your coursework and things like that. So again, here's the little code to initialize Fancy Box. And these again, inside of here are options. And then here's some jQuery that helps with the actual filter feature. So this says select the ID of filter, and which is going to be this drop down list. And when that changes, so this is the equivalent of a change function. On change, run this anonymous function, which has this little if-else statement and updates what's in the show method. Is obviously going to update what's in the visible area. Now, in my little selector, the class of image list, remember what that was. The class of image list we put in here. So here's the class of image list. And the anchor tag is visible. Let's read this. Again, it's easy to just try and copy and paste code, but you got to slow yourself down. I got to do it too. You got to slow yourself down and read the documentation thoroughly. That's what we're all going to struggle with here, is you're just going to want to copy and paste code and try it out, then it's not going to work. But if you read and slow yourself down, sometimes you might need to bind Fancy Box to dynamically add elements. Okay, so we don't have that. And what this is talking about is, for example, if you're reading items out of a database, like if a user does a search for products on your site and it returns 10 elements, or if it returns 15 elements or 20 elements, you're going to be more dynamically generating your code based on the results coming back from the database. And so because we're not doing that kind of advanced scenario, even writing this code doesn't make sense, because we're not quite at that point. But it says use the selector option to attach a click event for elements that exist now or in the future. Well, all of our elements exist now. It has nothing to do with the future. So this little chunk of code says, okay, if you were to like query a database and say, show me all the songs for this artist, and then you're going to put all of the song images, that return from the database inside of a Fancy Box, that those elements would exist in the future, because they're not statically coded into the website. So it doesn't really make sense to write this chunk of code, because we already have this without. But the reason I wanted to show you this is a lot of plugins. So here's the short version. A lot of plugins will require an initialization. Good luck smelling that. Did I get that right? An initialization method to run in order for the plugin to work. Okay, now FancyBox didn't, and sometimes these initialization methods, I mean, they can be real simple. As simple as something like this. So inside of your jQuery, you just call FancyBox. And this line 43 would be required for FancyBox or a plugin to work. Now, I didn't break anything, luckily there. Oh, look at that. It's got a nice little autoplay feature. Oh, look at all this built in. So, you know, to the point that I think a couple of people made in chat is a whole lot of functionality for just a little bit of code. I didn't even really need this. Really, what did I need to do? I needed to link to the plugin. I needed to write my HTML in a certain way, and I needed to link to the CSS to get this to work. And I think as we return to the PowerPoint, you're going to understand these steps a little bit better after my demonstration. Study the documentation. Again, that's critical for getting it to work. Link to your CDNs. That's number 2. Link to your CSS. That's step number 3. If you do download it, make sure you're linking to the files correctly, right? Make sure that you have the right links in your HTML to link to the CSS and link to the JavaScript. Code the HTML. I didn't have to code any CSS, but a lot of times you can customize it by coding CSS and what it looks like. And then step 6, it says, if necessary, write the jQuery code that uses the methods and options of the plugin. Again, we didn't get too deep into the options, but a lot of customization is done with options. And again, you get a lot of features by providing options inside of this initialization method that most or many plugins have. Okay, again, this doesn't really make sense for us to write because of what that actually does is not what we're doing. So that's plugins. That's why they're awesome. And does it require a little bit of time? I mean, I just took 30 minutes to cover the basics of one plugin. I didn't even really do a deep dive. But you get a whole lot out of it just by covering the basics. One thing the book does mention, and I kind of already talked about, is 2 things. Make sure that you include the script element for jQuery, and make sure the script element for the plugin comes after it. So I already mentioned that here, that this order matters. And another thing is that plugins are jQuery version dependent. Okay, so you'll notice here this dependency. FancyBox works with jQuery 3 and up. Okay, so they prefer version 3 and up, but it can work with some older versions. Okay, so you'll notice that the version of jQuery that we have here is 3.5.1, so it's nice and updated. But the version of FancyBox a lot of times works with a certain version of jQuery. So that's all in the documentation. You just have to make sure that the plugin code that you're writing is working with the right version of jQuery. So older plugins are going to work with older versions of jQuery. So if you have a new version of jQuery and an older plugin, you're going to have some compatibility issues. It's probably not going to work. It's not going to work. Okay? And, you know, after that, you know, I chose to demonstrate the Lightbox plugin, but there's other plugins. I mean, Lightbox is one that I like, but they list others. Here's one called BX Slider. They give you a URL for it. same kind of process, link to jQuery. Now look at that jQuery version, jQuery 1.8. So this is an old plugin. This box slider worked with an old version of jQuery. Is it compatible with 3.5.1? Probably not, right? Write a little bit of HTML. Remember I said a lot of plugins have an initialization method with options? That's what's demonstrated here, right? A lot of the options are what they call key. So min slides would be referred to as a key, and then a value is 2. So key and value pairs. So key colon value, key colon value, key. It's like a keyword, a keyword colon value. So a lot of options follow this kind of format, even going back to my code. Key, colon, and then value in quotes. Okay, if you have multiple of them, they're separated by commas. And then the last one in the list does not need a comma. So the last one in the list down here does not need the comma. And I always prefer, one thing that's a good practice, if you're not already doing this, I believe I've mentioned this before, it's always a good idea to kind of align comments with your ending parentheses and curly braces and semicolons. That just helps document everything, and it helps line things up visually. So again, Lightbox and box slider. We used Fancy Box, so they're just same process for Lightbox. Find the URL on the internet where you can find it, load the CSS, load the jQuery, the Lightbox jQuery script, write HTML in a certain way using attributes, and you get your functionality. So it's the same process pretty much for all these different plugins. And I'm not going to require you to, go through each one of these right now. Okay, let's go ahead and pause here. Okay, the next slide, slide 22, we left off talking about jQuery plugins, and what jQuery UI is a massive plugin. It's just a real big plugin that provides a lot of various, as the name implies, user interface features. And so features for the UI. And so let's take a look at jQuery. If you go to jQuery.com, jQuery UI is right off of the nav bar up here. And so this very top nav bar, there's actually a couple of different options up here. jQuery UI is the second one, which takes you to jQuery, where you just go to jQueryUI.com, obviously. Click this icon, takes you back to jQuery.com, jQueryUI.com. Okay. On the left-hand side, then, are the 4 categories of interactions. So you can make things draggable, droppable. So jQuery UI allows you to do, and some of this is more of a, okay, that's neat, but do I ever see myself using this? I mean, me personally, maybe, but okay, so you've got something draggable, droppable. You can make something resizable on the page, like a paragraph, heading. So, okay, the interactions, right. Selectable, you could do that with CSS. Sortable. Okay, so the interactions, I'm not a huge, okay, they're there if you need them. Widgets, though, these remind me a little bit of Bootstrap. So some of the things that you can do with this jQuery UI, you can do with Bootstrap, and in my opinion, if you can do it simply with Bootstrap, it's better than using jQuery UI. But an Accordion, definitely see that being a useful tool. But something like the tabs, you can get this kind of functionality. I believe there are tabs in Bootstrap. If not, we can learn how to do it with jQuery UI. There's a date picker. Now, what's nice about this date picker is that they're just using pure HTML. There's a calendar control with the input type of date. Okay, but if you recall, that wasn't like uniformly supported by all browsers, and jQuery is. jQuery UI is. Get different animations on our date picker. Let's get it to bounce in. All right. Do all sorts of fun stuff. So that's our date picker. So these widgets on the left-hand side. Anything else I want to show? Slider. Again, some of these are now just built into HTML5, and you might not need jQuery to provide a slider for you. But again, a lot of this can be with custom, you know, not like a static slide or a static progress bar, but maybe you're reading a dollar amount out of a database and you're raising money, and depending on how much money you've raised, this progress bar can be dynamically updated. Tooltip. Again, the benefit of using the tooltip on jQuery is it's going to give you a better cross-browser experience. There are some effects. Let's see. Now again, you don't need jQuery UI to use easing, but the easing plugin that we used, there are some. Let's see. So all the easing options that we learned about are built in here into jQuery UI. Actually, I wish I would have showed you this when we talked about easing, because this is actually a pretty good demonstration of how things transition in or transition out. Shaking my head. I know. They make it easy. Let's go back. So interactions and widgets and effects. Here they've got color animation. Remember that the animating color with the animate method. So we were not able to animate color. Now you can kind of see the background transitions from a white and just doesn't go straight to red. It's more of an animation of one color animating into another, changing over time. Okay, so that's just kind of an introduction of what jQuery UI offers us. You do have the option to kind of customize the things you need. And so if you know you don't want the interactions, you can remove them. Maybe... Oh, did I demonstrate effects? Let me go back to effects. Here's jQuery Effects. I like these. You know, what we had as far as our effects went earlier, again, when you're transitioning things onto the page or transitioning onto the page, we had like a fade in and a fade out and a slide up and a slide down. These are a lot more custom ways as far as ways to transition things onto and off of the page. Kind of get that little so again, these are custom effects on ways to get things on and off the page, and so I like these. So custom download is fine, or you could just get the whole thing. I'm wondering about a CDN for this, because obviously you can download it and you can link to it locally, but pretty sure I've used CDNs before. I'm sure they're out there somewhere. But just for this, let's download the full thing. And this is going to go onto my desktop. So that's a compressed version. So let's extract that. And now we've got an extra directory that we don't need, so I'll cut and paste. Let me close it here. Close, close. Homework. Let me close Visual Studio temporarily. Okay. So now we don't have an extra directory, we just got our directory here. I can delete the compressed. And here's our jQuery UI CSS. Again, this is just a plugin. jQuery UI is a plugin, so it's going to have a CSS document and a JavaScript file. And so let's use this. Let's start by linking to our jQuery CSS file. It's the minimized version. Let's link to jQuery then, which to link to jQuery, I go here, I go here. Let's go to the oops. I think it's code.jquery.com. We can get the CDNs, and let's get the uncompressed is fine. So now let's link to jQuery. Now let's link to jQuery UI. Script. jQuery UI.minimize.js. So that's a local link. And then any sort of custom jQuery here. All right. Link, 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 and we're linked. Let's go back to jQuery UI. Let's go to the accordion. Like any plugin, study the documentation. Want to learn more about the accordion widget, check out the API documentation. So the markup for an accordion needs pairs of headers and content panels. So we got div ID of accordion, first header, h3 div, h3 div. Here's our initiator for our accordion. So these are our options that we can read about. So let's start by putting in the markup for our accordion. Now just launching that should not get us an accordion, okay? Because we need the .accordion method to run. And the ID of accordion, so probably pound accordion class of selector, but there is no class of selector on our markup. So let's kind of take a look at this. I'm thinking ID of accordion, because that's this right here. Dot accordion, that's the method to initialize it. Let's see if we get any errors. No errors. I made a silly mistake. You just can't plop that anywhere. There we go. And again, we don't need that option in there. O-N. I spelled accordion wrong. Hey, we got an accordion. You'll notice here what I realized, and when I clicked on the API documentation, I came back to view source and saw the document ready. And that's what made me realize I wasn't, I realized my mistake, simple mistake. Pound accordion dot accordion, and again, the options are in this curly brace. If you don't have to have options though. So fairly simple process to get an accordion to work. Let's do another. Let's do an effect. Now, the effect, if you view this source, is a little bit more complicated because what they have is they have all these effects on a drop-down list, and so they're coding these effects based on the input that the user is giving. So that's when we need to look at the run effect. That's when we need to look at the documentation here. So let's look at the API documentation for the effects. Target the div dot effect, bounce and slow. And they do that on a click event. So let's wire up a click event. So let's wire up a click event. Let's make sure we got that wired up. Okay, click the paragraph and get an alert. So we got the click event wired up well. That's working. Then we're going to target, instead of doing an alert, we're going to target paraclick dot effect. Let's just do bounce slow. Okay, so we're getting an effect, which is not fading things on or off the screen, but the effect is working. Let's try a different one. Instead of bouncing, let's see what we do if we do puff. So puff does transition it off the screen. So demonstrating how these effects work. Now, just out of curiosity, let's do this. Let's hide this H1. I think it had the ID. When I just give it the ID of mom. Display none. So the H1's not there. So no H1, so it's not there. So when we click the paragraph, I want it to see if that will actually show the heading. Oh, it still does it. It still takes it off the screen. So it makes it visible and then it gets rid of it. So there's no way to get puffed. That could be a way to give someone an epileptic attack. Yeah, some of it, they got to be visible to do. All right, folks, so I demonstrated some widgets, some effects, and those are really some of the more useful things, in my opinion, about jQuery UI. So those are the types of features. That's the download. I showed you how to build the download. Link to the files. Look at the documentation. And experiment. Again, pretty common. You need to run that initialization code. So like on the Accordion, I ran the Accordion initialization method, just .accordion. You have to find out what to select, and you have to find out the name of the method. So here, what to select, and then the name of the method. I think these effects are pretty neat. If you tinker around with them, get some neat sort of transitions on and off the page without having to write your own custom animations. Just a heads up, you will have this jQuery UI on your next hands-on test. Tabs, same idea for tabs. Same idea for tabs. A date picker with no options. So again, you would just go to jQuery UI. Then find your date picker. And look at the source code. Input type of text, ID of date picker. Pretty simple. So let's put that in our code. And let's run this initialization method. And we got our jQuery date picker. Easy as can be. Again, I like this because it's cross-browser, because it's jQuery. It handles all that for us. And I also like it because I've coded a calendar using pure JavaScript. And I forget how many, maybe 1,500 lines of code to build a JavaScript calendar where it's dynamic like this, because obviously the day of the month starts on a different day every month, depending on the year and leap years, and to build a accurate calendar using JavaScript. Like I said, I want to say it was about 1,500 lines of code. So to take 1,500 lines of JavaScript and to simplify it, and by the way, done better than what I did, to simplify it to that, it does two things. Number one, that's awesome. I enjoy that. But number two, it kind of makes me feel like it was a waste of time, because they really simplified the job. I wasted my time back in the day. All right, folks. Well, that brings us to the end of this lecture on jQuery plugins. It's a little bit open-ended here, because a lot of the functionality comes from research. Okay? Finding a good plugin, reading the documentation, and tinkering with the code to get it to work. So that's what I want to encourage you to do. Very similar to what I did in this lecture, was pick a feature, pick a plugin, read the documentation, and tinker with it. Play with it until you get it to work. So pretty neat thing built into jQuery here.